Julian held a microphone, smiled at the 300 wealthy guests, and pointed at his own father like he was a joke. Then he shouted, "Who wants my boring dad for $2?" And the whole ballroom laughed. Arthur felt his face burn, his calloused hands shake, and his heart dropped so hard it felt like it hit the floor. Then, an authoritative voice from the back of the room said, "2 million." And the room went dead silent. So, tell me this. What kind of stranger pays $2 million for a retired watchmaker? And what did they come to take from his son tonight? The man on the stage is Arthur Sterling. He is 72 years old and he was currently suffocating under the bright spotlights. The heavy velvet curtains of the Grand Drake Ballroom suddenly felt like the walls of a cage. For several agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The elite crowd of Chicago froze with their champagne flutes halfway to their lips. The echoing laughter from Julian's cruel joke completely evaporated, replaced by a tense, suffocating quiet. The voice belonged to a woman stepping out from the shadows near the grand double doors. She did not wear a designer gown or sparkling diamonds. She wore a tailored black suit that looked meant for business, her posture rigid and uncompromising. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her sensible shoes clicking against the polished hardwood floor. Every head in the room turned to follow her path. The wealthy donors whispered to each other, their faces pale with confusion and sudden unease. Julian stood frozen on the stage. His perfect, practiced smile melted into a mask of pure confusion. He brought the microphone back to his lips, forcing a nervous chuckle that sounded thin and pathetic. He tried to speak, attempting to tell the woman that she had misunderstood his charitable humor, but his voice cracked. The woman did not smile. She stopped right where the stage lights met the shadows. Without a single word of hesitation, she reached inside her jacket pocket. She pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, holding it up for the entire room to see. The golden shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the harsh glare of the stage lights. "I am Special Agent Sarah Jenkins," she announced. Her voice did not need a microphone to command the massive room. "And this gala is now an active crime scene regarding federal financial fraud." The collective gasp from the 300 guests sucked the air out of the room. A woman in the front row dropped her crystal glass, the shattering sound violently cutting through the tension. Evelyn, Julian's glamorous wife, instantly took 3 steps backward, her eyes wide with terror as she physically distanced herself from her husband. Julian stared at the golden badge. The polished, charismatic chief executive officer vanished in the blink of an eye. In his place stood a terrified, cornered animal. His fingers went limp. The microphone slipped from his hand and slammed onto the wooden stage floor. A deafening screech of audio feedback pierced the ballroom, making people cover their ears and flinch in pain. Agent Jenkins kept her eyes locked entirely on Julian. "Julian Sterling, you are going to instruct your security to stand down. Tonight is over." Arthur sat on his tall stool, his breath caught in his throat. His chest ached violently. He looked at his son, the boy he had sacrificed his entire youth to raise after his wife walked out. He expected to see Julian step forward, take responsibility, or at least look back at his father with an apology for the horrific situation. He expected Julian to protect him. Instead, Julian took a frantic step backward. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that did not exist. He looked at the FBI agent, then at the exits blocked by men in dark suits, and finally, his gaze snapped toward Arthur. There was no love in Julian's eyes. There was only desperate, calculating survival. Julian raised his arm and pointed his trembling finger directly at the chest of his 72-year-old father. "Arrest him. Julian screamed, his voice raw and echoing with panic. "Do not look at me. Look at him. He is the one you want." The crowd gasped again, a wave of shock washing over the sea of wealthy faces. Arthur felt the blood drain entirely from his head. The ballroom spun around him. "I am just the face of the foundation." Julian continued to shout, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "My father handles the private accounts. Arthur Sterling. His signature is on every single bank transfer. He signed all the financial papers." Arthur could not breathe. The glare of the stage lights felt like a physical weight crushing his shoulders. His calloused, trembling hands gripped the edge of his stool to keep from collapsing. This was his son. The child he had carried on his shoulders, the boy he had stayed up late repairing broken toys for, the man he had loved with a blind, enabling devotion. Julian was not just throwing him under the bus. Julian had carefully, deliberately positioned him on this stage tonight to serve as a human shield. The $2 joke was just a cruel distraction. The real tragedy was that Julian was completely willing to sacrifice his own father to save his own skin. Agent Jenkins looked up at Arthur. Her sharp eyes softened just a fraction, holding a mixture of pity and stern resolve. "Mr. Sterling," Agent Jenkins said quietly, yet loud enough for Arthur to hear over the murmurs of the terrified crowd. "Please remain seated. We know exactly who signed what, and we know exactly why." Arthur stared at his son, watching Julian sweat and hyperventilate in his expensive tuxedo. In that devastating moment, the father realized the horrifying truth. The son he loved had died a long time ago, replaced by a hollow shell of greed and vanity. And that hollow shell was now trying to lock him in a prison cell. The grand ballroom descended into pure pandemonium. Wealthy donors scrambled over velvet ropes and knocked over crystal centerpieces in their rush toward the exit doors. The illusion of a sophisticated charity gala shattered completely, leaving behind only the ugly reality of fear and self-preservation. Arthur sat frozen on the stage. He watched the chaos unfold as if he were trapped underwater. The flashing lights of cameras going off blinded him. Reporters and guests alike were raising their phones, recording every second of his humiliation. He looked to his right, desperately hoping for a sliver of familial support, but Evelyn was already gone. His daughter-in-law had quietly slipped away from Julian the moment the federal badge appeared. She was now standing near the edge of the stage, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, whispering frantically to a security guard while entirely avoiding Arthur's gaze. She was a woman calculating her survival, cutting ties with a sinking ship without a single ounce of hesitation. Her cold indifference was just another knife twisting in his gut. Officers in dark windbreakers poured into the room, securing the perimeter. 2 agents stepped onto the stage and flanked Julian. The charismatic chief executive officer fought them, his voice pitching higher as he continued to hurl frantic accusations at the old man sitting just feet away. He screamed that he was innocent, that he was merely a victim of a senile, greedy father. Every single word Julian spat felt like a jagged piece of glass twisting into Arthur's chest. The cruelty in his son's voice was not born of sudden panic, but of a rehearsed, premeditated plan. Then, a younger agent approached Arthur. The young man did not grab him roughly, but the firm grip on Arthur's elbow was unmistakable. It was the grip meant for a suspect. "Sir, you need to come with us," the agent said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Arthur slowly descended the small flight of stairs from the stage. His knees trembled so violently he thought they might give out entirely. He had walked into this luxurious hotel as a father glowing with quiet pride, believing he was here to support his successful son. Now, He was being marched down the center aisle under the watchful, judging eyes of the city elite. He felt the heavy stares burning into his back. He heard the harsh whispers slicing through the ambient noise of the room. People who had laughed at his expense minutes ago were now murmuring about stolen charity funds and massive financial fraud, looking at his wrinkled face and oversized rented tuxedo with utter disgust. The walk down the long, carpeted aisle felt like a brutal eternity. With every step, a lifetime of illusions crumbled to dust beneath his feet. He remembered the nights he had worked double shifts at the watch repair shop, breathing in harsh chemical fumes and straining his eyes under magnifying glasses just to afford Julian's expensive college tuition. He remembered the immense pride he felt when Julian bought his first tailored suit, convincing himself that his son had finally made it, that the boy had conquered the deep insecurities left behind by a mother who had abandoned them both. Arthur had spent decades making excuses for his son. When Julian forgot birthdays, Arthur told himself the boy was just busy building a future. When Julian only called to ask for favors or money, Arthur told himself it was just how young, driven men behaved. He had poured every ounce of his unconditional love into a bottomless pit, mistaking Julian's narcissistic greed for ambition. He had equated his own constant sacrifices with good parenting. The cold night air hit Arthur's face as the agents guided him out the back service exit of the hotel. The sharp wind biting at his skin snapped him out of his daze, but it could not freeze the overwhelming agony consuming his heart. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the dark, damp alleyway. Photographers were already gathering at the perimeter, their flashbulbs exploding like silent fireworks in the night. He was not a guest of honor. He was a pawn. A human shield molded from decades of blind, enabling love. As the agent placed a hand on his head to gently guide him into the back of a squad car, Arthur looked back toward the heavy metal doors of the hotel one last time. He realized with terrifying clarity that the charming, smiling boy he loved had never actually existed. That smile, the one that had charmed thousands of donors and secured millions of dollars, was nothing more than a carefully constructed mask. And Arthur had spent his entire life polishing that very mask, deliberately ignoring the monster growing underneath it. The heavy door of the police cruiser slammed shut, sealing Arthur in the claustrophobic darkness of the back seat. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening, a stark contrast to the screaming ballroom he had just left behind. He stared at his calloused, wrinkled hands resting on his lap. These hands had fixed thousands of intricate, broken things over the years. Gears, springs, delicate clockwork faces. But looking at them now, under the alternating red and blue glow of the police lights, Arthur knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to fix the broken soul of his son. The betrayal was absolute, and the pain of it was a poison slowly seeping into his veins, destroying everything he had ever believed to be true. The fluorescent lights of the federal interrogation room buzzed with a low, mechanical hum. The walls were painted a sterile, lifeless gray, a sharp departure from the gold and velvet of the hotel ballroom. Arthur sat rigidly on a cold metal chair. His rented tuxedo jacket felt heavier than ever, clinging to his slumped shoulders. He stared at his own distorted reflection in the surface of the stainless steel table, his mind still reeling from the betrayal that had shattered his world just an hour ago. The heavy metal door clicked open. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins walked in, carrying the same thick blue folder she had held on the stage. She did not look angry, nor did she look triumphant. She looked at him with a weary, calculating patience. She pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, dropping the heavy file onto the table with a loud thud that made Arthur flinch. Jenkins opened the folder. She spread several pages of bank statements across the cold metal surface, sliding them toward the old watchmaker. Arthur looked down. His breath caught in his throat. Printed at the top of every single page, in stark black ink, was his own name. Arthur Sterling. Below his name were columns of numbers, deposits, and withdrawals that made his vision blur. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Millions of dollars. The sums were astronomical, moving in and out of accounts he supposedly owned. He had spent his entire life repairing broken watch springs for a few dollars an hour, yet here on paper, he was moving more wealth than he could comprehend in a lifetime. These accounts were opened 6 months ago, Agent Jenkins said, her voice steady and clinical. The money flowing through them does not match the donations of the Future Foundation. It is dark money. Illegal funds moving under the guise of charitable grants, all filtered through your name to keep Julian completely clean. Arthur stared at the pages, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The instinct of a father, the deeply ingrained habit of protecting his child at any cost, surged forward like a tidal wave. He could not accept that the boy he raised was a criminal mastermind. It was impossible. There had to be an explanation. He had to fix this, just like he fixed everything else that Julian broke. No, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he shook his head. He pushed the papers back toward Jenkins with a shaking hand. You do not understand. Julian is just overwhelmed. The foundation is expanding very rapidly. He told me they were opening new branches and he just needed temporary help with the administrative burden. Jenkins folded her hands on the table, her piercing eyes never leaving his face. She did not interrupt, letting him hear how hollow his own excuses sounded in the sterile room. He is a good boy, Arthur continued, his words spilling out in a desperate, pleading rush. He cares about people. He is just extremely busy. He probably did not even realize the accountants made a mistake. He is not a financial expert. He would never do something illegal on purpose. He is just trying to save the world, one charity event at a time. Even as the words left his mouth, they tasted like ash. Arthur remembered the cruel laughter in the ballroom. He remembered the finger pointing directly at his chest. But the habit of enabling his son was a thick, suffocating blanket he could not simply throw off. He had spent 3 decades justifying Julian's flaws, taking the blame for his son's tantrums, covering up his mistakes, and he was doing it again, even in a federal interrogation room. Jenkins did not yell. She did not pound her fist on the table to demand a confession. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression hardening into a look of absolute, unforgiving truth. Mr. Sterling, Jenkins said softly, yet her words cut deeper than any shout could. I need you to stop. I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are sitting here trying to build a defense for a man who just threw you to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. You are fiercely protecting a man who just sold you out to save his own chief executive chair. Arthur swallowed hard. The silence in the room became unbearable, broken only by the hum of the lights overhead. He did not make a paperwork error, Jenkins continued, her voice relentless and completely devoid of pity. He brought you to that gala tonight so that if we raided the event, you would be the one holding the bag. He dressed you up, put you on that stage to humiliate you, and prepared to watch you go to federal prison so he could keep his penthouse and his prestige. He used your love as a weapon. The illusion Arthur was desperately trying to cling to finally cracked, breaking apart under the crushing weight of reality. The bank statements on the table were not administrative mistakes. They were the meticulously planned trap of a narcissist. His son had not just used his name. His son had weaponized a father's unconditional, blinding devotion, turning the very act of parental sacrifice into the perfect criminal alibi. The harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room seemed to flicker, and as Arthur stared at the black ink of his own signature, the sterile gray walls dissolved. The memory pulled him backward, anchoring him in a dusty, dimly lit afternoon exactly 6 months ago. Arthur was sitting at his worn wooden workbench in his small watch repair shop. The air was thick with the familiar, comforting scent of brass polish, machine oil, and aged wood. All around him, dozens of antique clocks ticked in a steady, overlapping rhythm. It was a space of quiet precision, a sanctuary where broken things could always be put back together with enough patience and care. The brass bell above the front door jingled sharply, disrupting the peaceful symphony of ticking gears. Arthur looked up, adjusting his magnifying loupe. Standing in the doorway was Julian. His son looked entirely out of place, a sleek figure in a dark charcoal-tailored suit standing amidst shelves of forgotten, dusty antiquities. Julian rarely visited the shop. When he did, he usually stood near the door, careful not to brush his expensive clothes against the sawdust-covered counters. That afternoon, however, Julian did not stay by the door. He paced the narrow floorboards, his steps hurried and erratic. He pulled at his silk tie, loosening it with agitated fingers. His usually perfectly combed hair was slightly disheveled. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Arthur immediately put down his delicate tweezers. The instinct of a father flared to life. He wiped his hands on his canvas apron and asked his boy what was wrong. Julian let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the counter. He rubbed his eyes, painting a perfect picture of absolute exhaustion. He began to speak about the future foundation. He claimed the charity was expanding too fast, taking on massive new projects to build community centers and fund rural hospitals. The board of directors was allegedly breathing down his neck, demanding more financial stability on paper before approving the next phase of expansion. Julian looked up, his eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. He expertly shifted his tone from professional stress to deep, personal vulnerability. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. He told Arthur that the corporate world was full of sharks waiting for him to fail. He lowered his voice, letting it tremble just enough to sound completely broken. He said everyone was always doubting him, always waiting for him to prove he was not good enough. Then, Julian delivered the fatal blow. He brought up her. The mother who had walked out the door 30 years ago and never looked back. Julian whispered that he still felt like that little boy standing in the driveway, watching the taillights of his mother's car disappear into the dark. He said he had spent his entire life trying to build something important, trying to become someone who mattered so that people would stop leaving him behind. Arthur felt a familiar, heavy stone drop into his stomach. The complex, suffocating guilt of a single father consumed him. He had spent decades trying to overcompensate for the absence of a mother, trying to shield Julian from the reality that he had not been enough to make her stay. Seeing his grown son look so small and terrified shattered Arthur completely. Julian reached across the dusty counter and grasped Arthur by the hands. His grip was tight, desperate. He looked Arthur straight in the eyes and said that his father was the only person in the entire world he could truly trust. The only one who had never abandoned him. Then, Julian pulled a sleek leather folder from his briefcase. He opened it, revealing a stack of dense, legal documents. He framed it as a tiny, insignificant favor. A mere administrative formality. He explained that he needed to set up a secondary holding account to show the bank's strong, independent backing. He said he just needed a clean name, someone completely reliable and uncorrupted by the corporate board members. He promised it was entirely safe, a temporary measure that would secure the future of the charity and cement Julian's legacy. Arthur looked at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. His instincts, honed by years of repairing intricate mechanisms, told him to read the fine print to understand exactly how the gears of this contract turned. But Julian squeezed his hands tighter. Julian begged him, asking if his own father wanted to be the reason he failed. The guilt and the blinding love of a father overpowered the cautious logic of the watchmaker. Arthur just wanted his son to feel secure, to stop hurting, to know that his father would always catch him when he fell. Arthur reached for the silver pen resting on the contract. He did not read the pages. He did not question the bizarre corporate structure his son was describing. He simply signed his name on the dotted lines, trading his own safety for the illusion of his son's peace of mind. The rhythmic ticking of the antique clocks faded away, replaced once again by the cold, mechanical hum of the fluorescent lights. Arthur blinked, finding himself back in the interrogation room. He stared down at the bank statements spread across the stainless steel table. The black ink of his signature stared back at him, a permanent record of the exact moment his unconditional love had signed his own death warrant. The weeks following that fateful signature slipped by with deceptive quiet. Arthur returned to the comforting rhythm of ticking clocks and magnifying loops. But the illusion of normalcy did not last long. 2 months later, the letters began to arrive. They were heavy, cream-colored envelopes bearing the embossed logos of elite financial institutions Arthur had never set foot inside. At first, he left them unopened on his kitchen counter, convincing himself they were just the administrative updates Julian had mentioned. But the stack grew. The envelopes multiplied, arriving weekly, then almost daily. Arthur was a man whose entire life was governed by precision. He spent his days listening for the microscopic skip of a damaged gear and aligning tiny springs that were thinner than a human hair. He was fundamentally incapable of ignoring an anomaly. One rainy Tuesday evening, unable to silence the nagging voice in the back of his mind, he took a silver letter opener and sliced through the thick paper of the top envelope. The numbers printed on the glossy pages made his breath hitch. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being wired from accounts in his name to offshore entities he had never heard of. Deposits of staggering sizes appeared and vanished within 24 hours. There were shell companies, consulting fees, and massive asset transfers that made absolutely no sense for a charitable organization building community centers. Arthur did not immediately suspect his son of a federal crime. His fatherly instinct twisted the narrative, convincing him that Julian was simply in over his head. He worried that the ambitious boy was being taken advantage of by ruthless corporate accountants. Driven by a desperate need to protect his son, Arthur went to the local stationery store and purchased a small, dark leather notebook. Every night after closing the repair shop, Arthur sat at his kitchen table under the dim yellow light of an overhead bulb. He treated the bank statements like a broken pocket watch. He meticulously copied every single transaction into the leather notebook. He recorded the dates, the routing numbers, the exact amounts down to the final cent, and the bizarre names of the receiving companies. His handwriting was impossibly small and neat, creating a perfect, chronological map of the illicit money flow. He thought he was building a safety net to help Julian untangle a mess. He did not realize he was documenting a criminal empire. When the notebook was half full, Arthur could no longer bear the anxiety. He called Julian and practically begged him to come over for a home-cooked dinner. Julian arrived late, smelling of expensive cologne and gripping his ringing smartphone. He picked at the roasted chicken on his plate, his eyes constantly darting to the glowing screen. Arthur waited until the dishes were cleared before he brought the leather notebook out from the kitchen drawer and placed it gently on the table. Arthur opened the pages and softly asked his son to explain the massive offshore wires. He expected Julian to look confused. He expected his boy to ask for help. Instead, Julian stared at the neat columns of numbers, and his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Julian stood up so fast his wooden chair crashed to the linoleum floor. He did not offer an explanation. He went entirely on the offensive. He yelled that Arthur was snooping, that the old man had absolutely no right to monitor the private operations of a multimillion-dollar charity. Julian paced the small kitchen, his voice dripping with venom, accusing his father of being small-minded and suffocating. Arthur tried to speak, tried to say he was only worried, but Julian cut him down without mercy. Julian employed the most devastating weapon in his arsenal. He weaponized Arthur's deepest fear. Julian stepped close to his father, looking down at him with cold, dead eyes. He asked if Arthur wanted him to fail. He asked if Arthur was so jealous of his success that he wanted to tear the future foundation apart. Then, Julian lowered his voice to a dangerous whisper, stating that if Arthur could not trust him, perhaps Julian should simply walk out the door and never come back. Perhaps it would be better if Arthur learned what it truly felt like to be completely alone in the world. The threat hit Arthur like a physical blow to the chest. The terrifying prospect of an empty house, of losing the only family he had left, paralyzed him. The watchmaker crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and tears stung his aged eyes. Arthur apologized. He apologized for asking questions, for interfering, for doubting the brilliance of his son. Julian smoothed his silk tie, his anger vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a chilling, victorious calm. He told Arthur to burn the notebook and forget he ever saw the bank statements. Then, Julian walked out the front door, leaving his father alone in the silent kitchen. Arthur held the leather notebook in his trembling hands. He walked to the fireplace, intending to throw it into the flames just as Julian had ordered. But the watchmaker in him rebelled. He could not destroy a perfect record of the truth. He carried the notebook down into the basement, into the deepest corner of his repair shop. Years ago, he had built a heavy oak desk with a secret, secondary bottom drawer meant for storing precious antique gems. Arthur engaged the hidden latch, slipped the leather ledger into the dark recess, and sealed it shut. He buried the evidence of his son's sins beneath layers of wood and denial, choosing the agonizing comfort of a lie over the devastating reality of the truth. The low, mechanical hum of the fluorescent overhead lights dragged Arthur brutally back to the present. The comforting memory of his dusty watch shop faded away, replaced by the sterile gray walls of the federal interrogation room and the uncompromising stare of Special Agent Sarah Jenkins. She sat perfectly still, allowing the devastating reality of his son's premeditated trap to fully sink into the old man's bones. Before Arthur could find the words to defend himself, a sharp, vibrating buzz shattered the heavy silence in the room. The sound came from a clear plastic evidence bag resting near the edge of the stainless steel table. Inside the bag sat Arthur's personal belongings, confiscated during his arrest. His worn cellular phone was glowing, illuminating the crinkled plastic. Jenkins leaned over and picked up the bag. She looked at the illuminated screen, her jaw tightening. Without a word, she slid the bag across the smooth metal surface until it rested right in front of Arthur. "Read it," Jenkins commanded softly. Arthur leaned forward, his tired eyes struggling to focus on the bright, glaring letters. It was a text message from a completely blocked, unknown number. The message contained only 2 sentences, but they made the blood freeze in his veins. Asterisk, take the fall, old man. We know exactly where the watch shop is. Asterisk, a cold sweat broke out across Arthur's forehead. The air in the small room suddenly felt far too thin to breathe. He pushed the plastic bag away with trembling fingers, looking up at the federal agent in sheer horror. "Julian," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. Julian sent this. He is threatening to burn down my shop. No, Jenkins replied, her voice grim and absolutely certain. Your son is a desperate coward, but he is not the one sending those messages. He is just the puppet. The man pulling the strings is named Marcus Thorne. Arthur had never heard the name before, but the icy seriousness radiating from the agent made his stomach violently twist. Marcus Thorne operates a massive international money laundering syndicate, Jenkins explained, her eyes locking onto Arthur's pale face. He hides in plain sight behind the facade of a legitimate venture capitalist, but his actual clients are cartels, illegal arms dealers, and violent crime rings. Thorne needed a spotless, high-profile charity to wash his dirty cash without raising suspicion. Julian was ambitious, vain, and desperate enough for prestige to gladly open the door for him. Arthur felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea wash over him. The staggering columns of numbers he had meticulously recorded in his secret leather notebook were not just the result of corporate greed. It was blood money. His signature had been used to move funds that destroyed lives. Thorne is not a man who accepts apologies or bureaucratic delays, Jenkins continued, leaning closer to the table. When our bureau began quietly auditing the Future Foundation 3 weeks ago, Julian panicked. He knew Thorne would have him killed the moment the federal government froze those offshore accounts. So, Julian made a deal with the devil to save his own life. He promised Thorne that he had a bulletproof contingency plan. He promised them a perfect, unquestioning scapegoat. Jenkins raised her hand and tapped her index finger hard against the glossy bank statements scattered across the table, right next to Arthur's forged signature. Julian did not just set you up to take the blame for embezzling charity donations, Mr. Sterling. He sold your identity to a violent criminal syndicate. He assured Thorne's people that if the FBI ever came knocking, he would take the entire fall without speaking a single word. You were the human sacrifice required to keep your son breathing. The realization crashed down on Arthur with the devastating force of a collapsing building. The nightmare had just escalated from a terrible family betrayal to an immediate, lethal threat. The invisible men moving millions of dollars in the shadows knew exactly who he was, where he lived, and where he worked. They fully expected the quiet, enabling father to go to federal prison silently, carrying their massive criminal enterprise on his frail shoulders. His own flesh and blood had not merely pushed him into the line of fire. Julian had deliberately locked him in a cage with wolves, handed them the key, and walked away smiling. The heavy metal door of the interrogation room clicked open once more. Agent Jenkins stood up, silencing the mechanical hum of the room with her sharp movements. She looked at her cellular phone and then turned to Arthur with an expression of profound disgust. She informed the tired watchmaker that his son was demanding a private meeting. Julian was currently being held in a temporary custody cell located at the far end of the bleak federal corridor. He was entirely refusing to speak to his defense attorneys or answer any investigative questions until he spoke directly to his father. A microscopic fragment of Arthur, that foolishly hopeful part of his paternal soul, fluttered briefly in his chest. A desperate thought crossed his mind. Perhaps Julian had finally realized the sheer horror of his actions. Perhaps his son was going to fall to his knees, confess everything to the authorities, and protect his old father from the lethal wrath of Marcus Thorne. Driven by that tiny, fading ember of hope, Arthur nodded. He allowed the federal agents to escort him down the long, echoing hallway toward the holding cells. The transit felt like a march toward an execution. They stopped in front of a small, concrete holding room partitioned by a thick steel table firmly bolted to the floor. The heavy door was unlocked, and Arthur stepped inside. Julian was already waiting. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer who had mocked his father in front of 300 elite guests was completely gone. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket had been stripped away. His expensive silk tie was missing. His perfectly styled hair now hung in greasy, chaotic strands over his heavily sweating forehead. He looked like a cornered, panicked animal. The very second the heavy door locked behind Arthur, Julian collapsed. He threw his body onto the cold concrete floor, gripping the thick metal legs of the table. Violent sobs tore through his chest. Tears streamed heavily down his pale face, dripping onto his wrinkled dress shirt. He gasped loudly for air, putting on a spectacular, theatrical performance of absolute despair. "Dad," Julian wept, his voice cracking perfectly, resonating with a practiced agony. "I am so incredibly sorry. I messed up. I was in so deep with the wrong people. They pushed me into a terrible corner. I was terrified for my life. You have to believe me." Arthur stood absolutely frozen. He looked down at the tears tracking down his son's cheeks. Earlier that evening, before the gala, those tears would have utterly broken Arthur's heart. He would have rushed forward, thrown his arms around the boy, and promised to fix whatever was broken. But Agent Jenkins had just brutally shown him the truth. Arthur now knew about the cartel blood money. He knew about the text message explicitly threatening his watch shop. He knew that Julian had planned this betrayal long before the federal raid. The tears spilling onto the concrete floor were not born of genuine remorse. They were born of raw, selfish terror. Seeing his father standing silently, Julian frantically scrambled up from the floor. He leaned aggressively across the metal table, his eyes wide, manic, and pleading. He reached out and forcefully grabbed Arthur's wrinkled, calloused hands. Julian begged for his salvation. He claimed that the men working for Marcus Thorne would slaughter him in cold blood if he went to federal prison. He painted himself not as a mastermind, but as a naive victim of ruthless criminals who had manipulated his charitable intentions. Then, Julian delivered his ultimate request. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his words chilled the watchmaker to the marrow of his bones. "You have to take the blame for this, Dad. Please," Julian pleaded, his grip tightening painfully around Arthur's fingers. "You signed all the primary documents. The federal agents already think you did it. If you just confess to running those private accounts, they will let me walk free. I can fix this entire mess from the outside. I will hire the absolute best corporate lawyers in the country for you. I promise." Julian's voice grew increasingly frantic. His mask of a victim slipped, revealing the horrific, calculating narcissism beneath. "Think about this logically, Dad. You are 72 years old. You are an old man with a quiet life. The federal judge will absolutely be lenient with you. They will send you to a minimum security medical facility. It will be perfectly safe there. You will be fed, housed, and taken care of by doctors. You will not have to work anymore." Julian paused to catch his breath, staring wildly into his father's horrified eyes. "But I have my entire future ahead of me. I have the foundation. I have Evelyn. I have a massive legacy to build. You cannot let these people take my life away. You are my father. You have to save our family. Save our family." The horrific words bounced off the sterile concrete walls, echoing in Arthur's ears. Julian was explicitly asking his own father to spend his final, precious years rotting inside a federal medical prison, carrying the massive weight of cartel blood money, all so Julian could return to his luxury penthouse and his empty, glamorous life. Julian did not see Arthur as a human being with a soul, a life, or a right to freedom. Julian solely viewed his father as a disposable resource, a convenient asset to be entirely liquidated to pay for his own catastrophic sins. The deep, unconditional love Arthur had harbored for 3 decades finally turned to ash. The sterile concrete walls of the holding cell seemed to close in around Arthur. The silence following Julian's horrific request was absolute, thick and suffocating like a heavy wool blanket. Julian knelt on the floor, his hands still gripping Arthur's fingers with a desperate, bruising force. He looked up at his father with wide, expectant eyes, fully anticipating the same blind obedience he had successfully exploited for the past 30 years. He expected the old watchmaker to simply nod, to lower his head, and to willingly walk into a federal prison cell so his son could continue playing the role of a wealthy philanthropist. Arthur looked down at the man begging at his feet. He searched those familiar eyes for a trace of the little boy he used to know. He looked for the child who used to sit on his workbench, fascinated by the intricate gears of broken pocket watches. He looked for the frightened boy who used to hold his hand walking to school. But as Arthur stared into Julian's perfectly manicured face, he realized with terrifying clarity that the boy was completely gone. In fact, Arthur wondered if that boy had ever truly existed at all. Beneath the tailored clothes and the expensive cologne, Julian was completely empty. He was a bottomless void of vanity and self-preservation, a black hole that consumed everything and everyone around him without a single ounce of gratitude. Julian did not love his father. Julian only loved what his father could do for him. The decades of sacrifices, the double shifts at the repair shop, the quiet endurance of every insult and forgotten birthday, it had all culminated in this single, defining moment of ultimate betrayal. A strange, unfamiliar sensation began to bloom in Arthur's chest. It was not the familiar, crushing weight of parental guilt. It was not the desperate need to protect. It was a cold, quiet, and absolute clarity. The thick, blinding fog of enabling love finally lifted, revealing the stark, ugly truth of his own creation. He had not raised a son. He had cultivated a parasite. Arthur slowly pulled his hands away. He did not do it aggressively, but the motion was firm, deliberate, and utterly final. Julian's grip slipped, his hands falling empty to the cold concrete floor. "No," Arthur said. The word was soft, barely a whisper in the echoing cell, but it struck Julian like a physical blow. The younger man blinked, his tear-stained face twisting in sudden confusion. He tilted his head, as if he simply could not process the sound of that specific word coming from his father's mouth. "What did you just say?" Julian stammered, his voice losing its practiced, theatrical sorrow. Arthur stood taller. The invisible weight that had bowed his shoulders for 30 years seemed to evaporate. He looked directly into the dark, empty eyes of the monster he had helped create. "I said no," Arthur repeated, his voice finding a steady, resonant strength he did not know he possessed. "I will not confess to your crimes. I will not take the fall for your greed. I gave you life, Julian, but I did not give you the right to sell my soul." The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. The pathetic, weeping victim vanished into thin air. The mask of the terrified son shattered completely, revealing the rabid, cornered narcissist underneath. Julian scrambled to his feet, his face turning a dark, mottled red. The tears dried up immediately, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You ungrateful old fool!" Julian screamed, his voice tearing through the small room, echoing violently off the concrete walls. He lunged forward, stopping just inches from Arthur's face. "Do you have any idea what you are doing? You are signing my death warrant. Marcus Thorne will kill me. He will slaughter Evelyn. He will burn your pathetic little watch shop to the ground with you inside it." Julian began to pace frantically like a caged predator, running his hands through his greasy hair, spouting a torrent of vicious, poisonous abuse. He abandoned all pretense of love. He weaponized every insecurity Arthur had ever confessed to him. "You owe me this," Julian roared, pointing a trembling finger right between Arthur's eyes. "I brought you into the light. I let you sit at my table. You were nothing but a miserable, abandoned loser fixing broken clocks in a filthy basement until I made you a part of the future foundation. Mom left because you were weak, and now you are proving her right. You are a coward." The words were designed to annihilate, to strike the deepest, most vulnerable wounds in Arthur's heart. But to Arthur's own surprise, they did not hurt. The venom simply bounced off the new, impenetrable armor of his profound realization. He watched his son throw a violent, childish tantrum, kicking the metal table and screaming obscenities. Arthur felt no anger, no urge to argue, and absolutely no desire to fix the situation. He only felt an overwhelming, crushing pity. "You are right about one thing," Arthur said quietly, cutting through Julian's hysterical screaming. "I was weak. I was weak for 30 years. I let my fear of losing you blind me to the man you were becoming. But I am not weak anymore." Arthur turned his back on his son. He walked toward the heavy steel door of the holding cell and raised his hand to knock for the federal agents waiting outside. "If you walk out that door, you are dead to me." Julian shrieked, his voice cracking with a mixture of absolute fury and sudden, dawning terror. "Do you hear me? I am your only family. You will die completely alone." Arthur paused, his hand resting on the cold steel of the door. He did not turn around. He did not need to see the ugly, twisted face of the stranger standing behind him. "I have been entirely alone for a very long time, Julian," Arthur replied softly. "I just finally opened my eyes." He knocked twice on the heavy metal. The lock clicked, the door swung open, and Arthur Sterling stepped out of the cell, leaving his son screaming in the darkness. The heavy steel door slammed shut, instantly cutting off Julian's hysterical screams. Arthur stood in the sterile hallway, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The stale air of the federal building suddenly felt remarkably clean. The invisible, crushing weight of parental guilt that had bowed his shoulders for 30 years was entirely gone. He had walked into that cell as a victim, but he walked out as a free man. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins stood a few feet away, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She studied the face of the old watchmaker, clearly recognizing the profound psychological shift. The enabling father had finally died, replaced by a man who had chosen the brutal truth. Before Jenkins could offer a single word of comfort, the heavy silence of the corridor was shattered. A junior federal agent sprinted around the corner, his rubber saw squeaking loudly against the polished linoleum floor. He clutched a digital tablet to his chest, his face pale and tight with urgency. He rushed directly to Jenkins and whispered frantically into her ear. Arthur watched as the seasoned agent's sharp features hardened into a mask of pure alarm. She nodded once, dismissing the junior officer, and turned back to Arthur with eyes full of deadly seriousness. Jenkins told Arthur that the crisis was far from over. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder and guided him rapidly down the maze of sterile hallways. They stopped in front of a small, unmarked door. Jenkins swiped her keycard, and they entered a dimly lit observation room. Taking up the entire adjacent wall was a massive pane of one-way glass, looking directly into another interrogation room. Sitting alone at the metal table in the adjacent room was Evelyn. Arthur barely recognized his own daughter-in-law. The glamorous, untouchable woman who had sipped champagne at the gala just hours ago was completely shattered. Her stunning emerald silk gown was wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. Her expensive, meticulously applied makeup was ruined, leaving dark, chaotic streaks running down her pale cheeks. She was shaking violently, clutching her own arms as if trying to hold herself together. Evelyn was not crying for the tragic downfall of her husband. She was weeping entirely for her own survival. Evelyn was a creature of comfort, status, and ruthless self-interest. Confronted with the terrifying, inescapable reality of federal prison sentences and cartel hitmen, her supposed loyalty to Julian evaporated into thin air. She was demanding total federal immunity and immediate placement into the witness protection program. In exchange for her safety, she was singing like a canary, throwing her husband to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation. Jenkins pressed a small silver button on the wall console, allowing the audio from the interrogation room to filter through the overhead speakers. Evelyn's voice was shrill, trembling with absolute panic. She confessed to the investigating agent that Julian was a naive, arrogant fool. She explicitly stated that Julian genuinely believed he could outsmart a violent criminal mastermind like Marcus Thorne. She admitted she knew all about the forged signatures and the illicit offshore wire transfers, but she vehemently swore she had never touched the dark money directly. She painted herself as a helpless, terrified hostage trapped by her husband's reckless ambition. But her most crucial, terrifying revelation was not about Julian. It was about the smiling, excessively polite young man who fetched their coffee, managed the charity gala guest list, and frequently visited Arthur's watch shop. Trevor. Evelyn frantically explained, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch, that Trevor was never just an executive assistant. He was Marcus Thorne's eyes and ears planted deep inside the Future Foundation. Trevor was the ruthless cartel operative who managed the complicated logistics of the dark money. He was the one who meticulously ensured the inevitable federal audits would hit Julian and Arthur, leaving Thorne completely insulated and untraceable. Arthur felt a block of ice form in his stomach. He remembered Trevor vividly. The young man had visited the suburban watch shop multiple times, always carrying thick folders of documents for Arthur to sign, always offering a warm, respectful smile and asking about antique clocks. That polite, charming facade had hidden a cold-blooded cartel enforcer. Through the overhead speaker, Evelyn dropped the final, devastating bombshell. She revealed that the moment the federal agents had swarmed the ballroom, Trevor had seamlessly slipped out through the hotel kitchen service exit. Julian had desperately signaled him to enact the final cartel contingency protocol. The criminal syndicate needed to permanently sever the absolute last physical link between Thorne and the forged charitable accounts. They needed the original signed contracts, the bank letters, and any personal financial records Arthur might have kept. Evelyn looked wildly around the interrogation room, her eyes wide with terror. She screamed that Trevor was not running away to hide. He was heading straight for the quiet suburbs. He was going to Arthur's house to completely destroy the watch repair shop and incinerate every single piece of paper inside it. Jenkins instantly released the audio button, cutting off Evelyn's hysterical sobs. The observation room fell into a dead, horrifying silence. She looked slowly at Arthur. If Trevor destroyed the original forged documents, the federal prosecutors would lose their absolute strongest leverage against the cartel. Worse, if Trevor found and destroyed Arthur's secret leather notebook, the one meticulously filled with the exact dates, amounts, and routing numbers of the cartel blood money, the entire trail to Marcus Thorne would vanish forever into the ashes. Arthur would be left holding the entire federal indictment, facing decades behind bars, while the true criminals walked free. The quiet peace Arthur had found just moments ago was instantly annihilated by a surging, adrenaline-fueled panic. The sacred sanctuary where he had spent his entire life, the quiet haven filled with ticking clocks and memories of a simpler time, was about to be burned to the ground by a violent cartel operative. Jenkins grabbed her tactical radio from her belt, loudly barking urgent orders to her heavily armed dispatch team. She looked at Arthur, her eyes blazing with an intense, fierce urgency. She told him they had to move right that very second. The race against time had officially begun. The heavy doors of the federal building burst open, spilling Arthur and Agent Jenkins into the freezing Chicago night. The rain had started to fall, transforming the pavement into a slick, black mirror reflecting the frantic flashing of red and blue emergency lights. Jenkins did not gently guide him this time. She grabbed Arthur by the arm, her grip tight and urgent, propelling him toward a massive, armored black sports utility vehicle idling at the curb. Two heavily armed tactical agents were already in the front seats, the engine roaring with a deep, aggressive rumble. Jenkins shoved Arthur into the back seat and dove in right beside him, slamming the heavy door shut. Before she could even buckle her seatbelt, she shouted an address to the driver. The vehicle lurched forward with a violent screech of tires, throwing Arthur back against the leather seat. The siren erupted, a deafening, continuous wail that tore through the quiet city streets. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air smelled of damp wool, gun oil, and pure adrenaline. The police radio on the dashboard crackled continuously with sharp, coded commands from dispatch, coordinating local units to converge on the quiet suburban address. Jenkins sat rigidly, her eyes locked on the road ahead, her hands tightly gripping her phone. She was calculating response times, praying the local patrol cars would beat the cartel operative to the front door. Arthur stared out the rain-streaked window. The glowing city skyline blurred into streaks of neon and shadows. His heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs, but the initial shock of Evelyn's revelation had begun to curdle into a profound, suffocating sorrow. They were racing toward his home. That small, modest house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac was never just a building of wood and brick. It was the physical manifestation of his entire existence. It was a museum of his sacrifices. He remembered carrying Julian over that threshold as a newborn, terrified and entirely overwhelmed by the fragile weight in his arms. He remembered sitting on the peeling front porch steps, holding a weeping 5-year-old Julian on the devastating night his wife packed her bags and drove away forever. Every single room in that house held the ghost of his enabling love. The scratched wooden kitchen table where they had eaten countless dinners of cheap boxed macaroni, Arthur claiming he had already eaten at work just so his growing boy could have a second helping. The narrow hallway where he had proudly marked Julian's height on the doorframe, measuring the boy's growth year after year. And then there was the watch repair shop. It was his sanctuary. It was the one place in the world where chaos could be ordered, where broken things could be meticulously restored to perfection. The smell of brass polish, aged wood, and fine machine oil was etched into his very DNA. It was the place he had retreated to when the burden of single fatherhood felt too heavy to bear. It was the place where he had hidden the dark leather notebook, desperately hoping to protect his son from the consequences of his own vanity. Now, that sacred space was a designated target for a bloody cartel purge. Trevor, the impeccably dressed, polite young assistant who had complimented Arthur's antique clock collection just weeks ago, was currently speeding toward that house with the sole intention of reducing it to ashes. The sheer, horrifying magnitude of Julian's greed washed over the old watchmaker. Julian had not simply stolen charity funds. He had not merely thrown his father to the federal wolves to save his own skin. By partnering with Marcus Thorne and dragging the cartel into their lives, Julian had invited a violent monster directly into their home. He had traded the safety of the very roof that had sheltered him for a fleeting taste of corporate power and a luxurious penthouse. "We are exactly 7 minutes out," the driver shouted over the blaring siren, swerving violently to bypass a slow-moving delivery truck. Jenkins pressed a button on her radio, ordering the approaching local units to kill their sirens and lights when they entered the neighborhood. They could not afford to spook Trevor if he was already inside. She turned to Arthur, her expression softening just a fraction beneath the harsh tactical glow of the dashboard. She told him to prepare himself. She warned him that men like Trevor did not leave clean crime scenes. Arthur closed his eyes tightly, praying for the first time in decades. He did not pray for his own safety. He did not even pray for Julian. He prayed that the hidden latch under his heavy oak desk would hold. He prayed that the meticulous craftsmanship of a tired, broken watchmaker would be enough to outsmart a ruthless cartel enforcer. The armored vehicle took a sharp, aggressive turn, the tires sliding slightly on the wet asphalt before catching traction. The bright streetlights of the commercial district faded, replaced by the dim, familiar glow of residential lampposts. They were entering his neighborhood. The houses passed by in a blur, quiet and completely unaware of the federal storm tearing through their streets. The driver killed the siren. The sudden, heavy silence inside the vehicle was entirely terrifying. They rounded the final corner, turning onto Arthur's street. Through the rain-slicked windshield, Arthur saw it. His small, white house stood at the end of the block. But the warm, inviting porch light was off, and the front door was standing wide open, swinging like a broken pendulum in the wind. The monster had already arrived. The heavy armored vehicle skidded to a violent halt at the curb. Before the sports utility vehicle even fully stopped, the tactical doors flew open. Four heavily armed agents poured out into the driving rain, their assault rifles raised and sweeping the perimeter. Agent Jenkins shoved Arthur firmly down behind the ballistic door of the vehicle, ordering him to stay completely out of the line of fire. Arthur crouched in the freezing rain, his heart hammering against his ribs. He watched the tactical team move with terrifying, silent precision up his familiar concrete walkway. The front door of his home had not just been left open. It had been brutally kicked off its hinges, the wooden frame splintered and hanging by a single piece of twisted metal. A loud, chaotic crash echoed from deep inside the house, followed immediately by the sound of shattering glass. It was coming from the basement. It was coming from the watch repair shop. Jenkins drew her sidearm and signaled the breach. The tactical team flooded through the broken doorway, moving like fluid shadows. Arthur could not stay behind the vehicle. Driven by a desperate, agonizing need to protect his sanctuary, he scrambled up from the wet asphalt and followed Jenkins into the hallway, ignoring her fierce whispered command to stay back. The inside of his home was a nightmare. The living room had been completely ransacked, sofa cushions slashed and bookshelves emptied onto the floor. But the violent noise was entirely concentrated below them. Jenkins and the team descended the narrow basement stairs. Arthur stumbled down right behind them, the sharp smell of smoke and chemical accelerants suddenly hitting his nostrils. The scene in the basement made Arthur physically sick. His sacred workshop, a place of quiet precision and decades of peace, had been utterly annihilated. Dozens of rare antique clocks were smashed into unrecognizable piles of splinters and twisted gears. The glass display cases were shattered, covering the floor in a treacherous layer of shark shards. In the center of the destruction stood Trevor. The perfectly tailored suit and the polite, eager smile were completely gone. He wore a dark tactical jacket, his face smeared with soot and sweat. He was acting with the frantic, feral energy of a cornered predator, violently ripping wooden drawers completely out of their sockets and throwing them against the concrete walls. In the middle of Arthur's primary workbench, a small but intense fire was burning inside a metal trash bin. Federal agents. Jenkins screamed, leveling her weapon. "Get down on the ground right now." Trevor spun around, dropping a heavy steel crowbar onto the floor. He did not raise his hands. He took a sudden, aggressive step toward the burning bin, but the tactical team was faster. Two massive agents hit him simultaneously, tackling him brutally into a pile of broken clocks. Trevor thrashed and fought with shocking strength, kicking and violently twisting his body, but the agents quickly pinned him down, slamming a pair of heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. Arthur stood at the bottom of the stairs, trembling uncontrollably as he looked at the burning metal bin. The flames were rapidly consuming thick stacks of paper, the edges curling and turning black. The distinct smell of burning ink and aged paper filled the basement. Trevor, now securely pinned face down against the cold concrete floor, wrenched his neck to the side. He saw Arthur standing there, pale and utterly devastated. Despite the federal agents pressing their knees into his back, the cartel operative smiled. It was a cold, empty, and terrifyingly cruel smirk that made Arthur's blood run completely cold. Trevor let out a dark, mocking laugh that echoed terribly over the crackle of the fire. He stared directly into Arthur's terrified eyes, his voice chirping with absolute victory. "You are too late, old man," Trevor spat, grinning maliciously from the floor. "You will never find the evidence you need to save yourself. I already burned every single piece of paper on your desk." Arthur stared at the flames licking the edge of the metal bin. The federal agents frantically grabbed a chemical extinguisher from the wall, unleashing a thick white cloud of foam to kill the fire, but it was obvious they were too late. The documents resting on top of the desk had been completely reduced to useless, blackened ash. Trevor laughed again, a harsh, victorious sound that echoed through the ruined room, fully believing he had just successfully burned Arthur Sterling to the ground. The thick white chemical foam settled over the scorched surface of the heavy oak workbench. The acrid stench of burnt paper and melting plastic hung heavy in the damp basement air. Pinned to the concrete floor by two massive federal agents, Trevor continued to laugh. It was a breathless, chaotic sound that grated against the quiet tragedy of the ruined room. He wrenched his neck to look up at Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, his soot-stained face twisting into a mask of pure arrogance. Trevor boasted that the federal government was entirely too slow. He spat onto the floor and proudly declared that the primary ledgers, the bank letters, and every single physical copy of the forged charity contracts were now nothing more than carbon dust floating in the metal bin. He gloated that Julian was a pathetic fool, but the cartel had successfully severed the final link. Jenkins stared at the smoldering ashes. Her sharp features tightened with intense frustration. She knew that without those original documents, tying Marcus Thorne to the illicit offshore accounts would require years of grueling forensic accounting, and Arthur might still be left holding the primary indictment. Arthur stood frozen at the bottom of the wooden stairs, his chest rising and falling as he surveyed the total destruction of his sanctuary. He looked at the shattered glass of the display cabinets. He looked at the crushed brass gears and the broken clock faces scattered across the cement floor. Trevor had operated like a hurricane, relying on absolute brute force and violent chaos to achieve his goal. But Trevor was a man of violence, not a man of precision. He did not understand the mind of a master horologist. He did not understand a man who had spent the last 50 years building and repairing mechanisms that operated on fractions of a millimeter. Arthur did not collapse in despair. He did not weep over the shattered antique clocks. A profound, icy calm washed over his tired bones. He stepped forward, his leather shoes crunching loudly over the broken glass. Trevor sneered from the floor, struggling against the heavy knees of the arresting officers. He taunted the old man, telling Arthur to go ahead and cry over his broken toys. Trevor cruelly added that Arthur should start getting used to small, locked rooms, because he would be dying in a federal medical prison. Arthur completely ignored the cartel operative. He did not offer a single word of anger or retaliation. He walked straight toward the heavy oak workbench. The primary drawers had been violently yanked out, their wooden tracks splintered and broken. The surface was completely ruined by the chemical foam and the black ash. Jenkins stepped forward, gently raising her hand. She softly warned Arthur not to touch the crime scene, assuming the old watchmaker was simply trying to salvage a piece of his destroyed life. Arthur raised a single, calloused finger, asking for just one moment. He reached his hands underneath the thick, seemingly solid front lip of the heavy oak desk. He ran his fingertips along the smooth, undamaged wood. He was not looking at the desk. He was feeling for a tiny, almost imperceptible groove he had meticulously carved into the oak 30 years ago. His rough fingers found the small brass lever, a mechanism completely hidden from view and entirely disconnected from the main drawer tracks that Trevor had so violently destroyed. Arthur pressed the brass lever upward and slid it precisely 2 inches to the right. A soft, distinct mechanical click echoed clearly in the quiet basement. From the thick, solid bottom panel of the desk, a hidden secondary drawer smoothly dropped down on perfectly oiled metal glides. The entire room fell dead silent. The harsh, arrogant laughter died in Trevor's throat. The cartel operative stopped struggling against the federal agents. His smirk froze, then slowly melted into an expression of absolute, paralyzing terror. Inside the hidden wooden compartment, completely untouched by the fire, the chemical foam, or the violent ransacking, lay a pristine stack of thick legal papers. Resting securely right on top of those original contracts was the dark leather notebook. Arthur reached into the secret compartment and pulled out the notebook. He turned around and walked over to Special Agent Jenkins. He handed the heavy ledger directly into her hands. He spoke with a quiet, unwavering authority that commanded the attention of every federal officer in the room. Arthur explained that every single wire transfer, every offshore routing number, and every illicit deposit was meticulously documented inside those pages. He told her that the drawer also contained the original, unaltered contracts his son had brought to the shop 6 months ago. The ironclad evidence had not been destroyed. The roadmap to dismantle Marcus Thorne's entire financial empire was perfectly preserved. Jenkins opened the leather cover, her eyes widening as she scanned the incredibly neat, microscopic handwriting detailing millions of dollars in cartel blood money. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. She looked at Arthur with profound respect, realizing the quiet watchmaker had just handed the federal government the greatest financial prosecution victory of the decade. Arthur finally turned his gaze downward to look at Trevor. The young cartel operative was pale, trembling, the devastating reality of his massive failure crashing down upon him. He knew that Marcus Thorne did not forgive failure. Arthur looked at the terrified man on the floor. He stated softly that people who rely entirely on violence and intimidation always make the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet patience of a craftsman. The heavy chain of enabling love was permanently broken. The suffocating manipulation of a narcissistic son had finally been dragged out of the shadows. The truth had survived the fire, perfectly preserved by the very same meticulous hands that had once worked so desperately to fix everything else. 3 months passed with agonizing slowness. The damp cold of the Chicago winter gave way to a bleak, gray spring. Inside the imposing mahogany walls of the federal courthouse, the air was entirely devoid of warmth. The high-vaulted ceilings echoed with the quiet murmurs of reporters and curious spectators who had gathered to witness the highly publicized downfall of the Future Foundation. Julian Sterling sat at the heavy oak defense table. The dazzling, charismatic chief executive officer was completely dead and buried. In his place sat a frail, trembling man swimming inside an oversized beige prison uniform. His skin was pasty and deeply shadowed, his perfect hair now thinning and completely devoid of its former styled luster. He kept his head bowed, his hands shackled to a thick chain around his waist, desperately avoiding the searing gaze of the public gallery. Without his luxury suits, his sycophantic assistants, and his stolen wealth, Julian was reduced to his absolute truest form. He was nothing but a terrified, hollow shell. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The bailiff called the primary witness for the prosecution. Arthur Sterling walked down the center aisle. Arthur did not wear a rented tuxedo. He wore his own simple, charcoal gray suit, the one he reserved for funerals and solemn occasions. He walked with a slow, measured, and incredibly steady pace. The crippling anxiety that had defined his existence for the past 30 years was entirely gone. When he took the oath and sat in the wooden witness box, he looked directly at the defense table. Julian finally lifted his head, his dark eyes brimming with a pathetic, desperate plea for mercy. Arthur felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of enabling parental love had been completely drained the night his son had asked him to die in a federal medical prison. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, acting as the primary investigative liaison for the prosecution, watched closely from the first row as the federal prosecutor began the questioning. Arthur answered every single question with the meticulous, unwavering precision of a master watchmaker. He did not raise his voice. He did not cry. He displayed no anger, no hatred, and no dramatic agitation. His voice resonated through the silent courtroom with a bitter, devastating calmness. He calmly explained how Julian had manipulated his guilt over a broken marriage to secure the initial forged signatures. He described the arrival of the massive bank statements and his growing, terrifying realization of the massive financial fraud. With surgical accuracy, Arthur detailed the creation of the secret leather ledger, explaining how he had meticulously recorded every illicit offshore wire transfer and every penny of cartel blood money that Marcus Thorne had laundered through his name. Every calm, deliberate word Arthur spoke acted as a scalpel, carefully and permanently excising the toxic tumor he had allowed to grow inside his family. He was dismantling his son's carefully constructed empire of lies piece by piece in front of a federal judge and a captivated audience. When the defense attorney attempted to aggressively question him, trying to paint Arthur as a bitter, senile old man looking for revenge, Arthur did not flinch. He simply looked at the lawyer and stated that a father who seeks revenge acts out of hatred, but a father who seeks the truth acts out of a necessity to stop a monster. The entire courtroom fell dead silent. The defense attorney slowly sat down, completely defeated by the sheer, undeniable gravity of the old man's integrity. The trial moved swiftly after Arthur's testimony. With the original contracts, the hidden ledger, and the corroborating testimony from Evelyn, the federal jury did not need to deliberate for very long. When the judge finally read the verdict, Julian collapsed back into his wooden chair, his chest heaving with silent, gasping sobs. The judge looked down from the high bench, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. He condemned Julian for weaponizing charitable goodwill and exploiting his own vulnerable father to facilitate the operations of a violent international crime syndicate. The sentence was absolute and utterly crushing. The judge handed down a consecutive sentence totaling 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. The sound of the heavy wooden gavel striking the sounding block echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Julian by his arms to haul him away to begin his new, permanent reality. As they dragged him past the witness box, Julian twisted his head back, his eyes wide with a final, desperate panic. He opened his mouth, perhaps to scream a final curse or to beg for a forgiveness that no longer existed. Arthur simply turned his face away. He looked toward the high stained glass windows of the courtroom, watching the gray morning light filter through the dust motes. He did not watch his son disappear through the heavy side door. The surgery was finally over. The poison was completely gone, leaving behind a clean, albeit empty, quiet space. Exactly 1 year had passed since the sound of the judge's wooden gavel echoed through the federal courtroom. Arthur Sterling stood quietly in his basement workshop. The shattered glass had long been swept away. The burned workbench had been replaced by a sturdy, new slab of solid maple. The federal agents and their armored vehicles were gone. The reporters and the whispering neighbors had completely moved on to the next major scandal. The silence in the room was no longer heavy, terrifying, or suffocating. It was deeply peaceful. Arthur carefully adjusted his magnifying loupe and leaned over the intricate brass gears of an antique grandfather clock. He picked up his delicate silver tweezers, gently nudging a tiny, perfect spring into its rightful place. A slow, steady ticking sound immediately filled the quiet basement. It was a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat signaling that something incredibly broken had finally been meticulously restored. He wiped his calloused hands on his clean canvas apron and took a step back to admire his work. His mind drifted briefly back to the extravagant charity gala at the Grand Drake Ballroom. He thought about Julian standing under those blinding spotlights, offering his own flesh and blood up to the highest bidder just to get a laugh from a crowd of strangers. His son had desperately tried to convince the world that Arthur was a boring, worthless old man, pricing his entire existence at exactly $2. But as Arthur listened to the steady, comforting rhythm of the restored clocks surrounding him, he smiled. It was a small, quiet smile born of profound internal peace. He finally understood that the greatest revenge in life is not violently destroying the people who hurt you, nor is it forcing them into a corner to watch them suffer. The absolute ultimate revenge is simply walking away from the invisible strings they use to control you. It is daring to live out the rest of your days entirely free from being a puppet to someone else's bottomless vanity. The world could try to appraise a man at $2 to publicly break his spirit, but the quiet, unwavering dignity of a person who finally finds the courage to speak the absolute truth is truly priceless. The grand clock struck the hour, its chime ringing clear, bright, and beautifully resonant, marking the peaceful beginning of a brand new day. This story brings us face to face with a profound and often painful reality about family dynamics and the true nature of unconditional love. We are taught to protect our loved ones at all costs, but love should never require you to completely sacrifice your own moral compass or your personal safety. True family will never ask you to carry the devastating weight of their deliberate, selfish crimes. Arthur's journey teaches us that sometimes, the absolute bravest and most loving thing a parent can do is to stop protecting a child from the very real consequences of their own destructive actions. Walking away from toxic, manipulative relationships is never a sign of failure or weakness. It is the ultimate display of personal strength, courage, and necessary self-respect. How did this emotional story make you feel today? Can you relate this narrative to your own real-life experiences? Have you ever found yourself feeling trapped by the heavy expectations of the people you love the most? Or have you ever been forced to make a heartbreaking, difficult decision just to protect your own inner peace and dignity? We truly want to hear your personal reflections straight from the depths of your heart. Please take a moment to share your feelings and your stories in the comments section below so we can listen and learn from each other. If Arthur's powerful journey of finding his voice and reclaiming his self-worth touched your soul, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends and family, and subscribe to our channel. Your wonderful support allows us to continue bringing you more captivating, highly dramatic, and deeply emotional stories every single day. We want to sincerely wish everyone watching this video abundant good health, a truly joyful life, and deep, lasting daily peace. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen and connect with us today. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.